Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I wanted to talk about the Season 3 dungeon pool and how it's actually looking going into patch 10.2. For those that don't know, the 8th and final dungeon of the pool was made available for testing as of this weekend, so now we've been able to kind of see and test every single dungeon, see what's changed, how they've been adapted to Mythic Plus. So I just wanted to take a bit of time here, walk through each of them as I've been playing quite a bit of PTR. Now this won't be kind of like a guide video at all, just my thoughts on the dungeons themselves and maybe what needs to change, how fun they are, how I like them, what needs a rework or a change, whatever. But if you are interested in guide content, I will be putting those out closer to the patch release date, so make sure you subscribe to the channel to see those. To start, let's do a quick refresher here on what the dungeon pool actually is. From Dragonflight, there are actually only 2 dungeons, which is the Dawn of the Infinite Mega Dungeon being split in 2. Along with that, we have a couple BFA dungeons, Waycrest Manor, fan favorite, and Atal'Dazar, a couple Legion dungeons, Blackrock Hold and Darkheart Thicket, again kind of following that Emerald Dream theme we have in the patch. And we've also got the Everbloom, which is the Warlords of Draenor dungeon, and finally, the most recent addition that we started testing this week was a full rework to the Throne of the Tides dungeon from Cataclysm. So let's start off by talking about Dawn of the Infinite. So this is split into 2 parts, like I mentioned. The first half is actually the first 4 bosses, so up to and including Galakrond, and that's Galakrond's Fall. The second half is starting at Tyr, going to the end of the dungeon, and that's called the Murozond's Rise. Starting with the first half, I think this dungeon only actually has a couple pain points that I'd like to see addressed before it goes live. That being, trash in some areas feels very overtuned, particularly around the second boss area, but there's some other places as well. And then the other big thing is excessive travel time. Now, there's been a lot of discussion recently about RP time in both of the Dawn dungeons, which was worse in the second half of the dungeon, but it still existed in the first half. And just this past week, we saw some of that was addressed. And I think in the first half of the dungeon, it's pretty well solved. There's not a lot left, and most or maybe half of what is left, you can actually fight trash during, so it's not really a big deal. However, the amount of time that you spend like traveling on like a flight path or running across an empty or mostly empty platform, not fighting anything, is still just insanely high. A great example, after you've defeated the second boss, you walk through that portal, which puts you on like a flight point to another platform that has like a dragon mob that you can skip or fight, and you have to run across that entire platform, take another flight point portal to another platform, run across that platform, wait for a little bit of RP, and then walk through that door to finally be teleported to the trash in front of the third boss. To me, that all feels extremely unnecessary in a Mythic Plus dungeon. I don't know why it's still there. I think if you just made that first flight point portal, so right after the second boss, that portal, just make that a real portal to the third boss's room. And that's literally minutes of runtime that is just cut out immediately with one change like that. And I think that makes the dungeon flow way better. It's way more fun. I don't know why we need, 2 minutes of flight time or whatever the heck it is in the middle of a Mythic Plus dungeon where it's about timer speed, and that would let you reduce the timer accordingly, because there's been a lot of talk about how the dungeons this season are either 30 minutes or whatever, 38, 39 minutes, and there's like not much in between there. So that would let you also, hey, maybe we can take some off the timer accordingly. And if you're worried about that dragon mini boss that exists in that area that you would be skipping, well, you have enough room near that third boss trash to put it there if you really don't want to cut it out of the dungeon. So it's not like you have to get rid of it entirely. Just an idea, but personally, when I think about runtime like this, I think back to a dungeon like The Other Side, and I just remember being extremely annoyed with the amount of backtrack running that you had to do in that dungeon. While this isn't backtracking, it's just as annoying. So hopefully that gets preemptively dealt with. In terms of trash stuff, like I said, some things feel overtuned. Like there are Bladestorm guys, they will instantly teleport on someone and tick for like really massive damage. That's an easy fix, I think. Give them like a cast time or just some grace period before the damage starts. Makes it much easier to handle. You don't even need to nerf the damage number at all. Just give players some way to avoid it. Trash in the second boss room, just a lot of overtuned stuff. There's like 3, maybe more random targeting abilities that happen in that area. If you ever get 2 of them at the same time, which, sometimes all 3 of them are in a trash pack. If you ever get 2 of them at once, you're just dead. They all just kind of seem overtuned compared to other dungeon trash abilities, so hopefully that gets handled. There's also some bugs in this area where you can like aggro some of those interval untargetable mobs without them becoming targetable, and they just start hitting you and killing you. Not ideal. The leeches in that area melee for magic damage, so tanks are in complete pain the whole time. There's just some stuff in there that needs to get addressed for Sure. The bosses, though, I think across the board are in a decent spot. I don't even think they need to be touched at all, honestly. And if you take into account that those trash nerfs happen, assuming they happen, I actually think this is going to be one of the more pug-friendly dungeons. Again, assuming those nerfs happen, we'll have to wait and see. But I think this could be one of the easier dungeons of the season as well, if that actually does happen. That brings us to the second half of Dawn of the Infinites, which definitely needs a bit more work than the first. I think the first area with the tier platform and the tier boss fight are really, really good. I actually like a lot of the stuff there. You do start to get some no-good vibes in this dungeon a little bit because you've got to kill 3 mini-bosses to spawn tier. Later on, you have to kill a bunch of those, the portal keeper ads, whatever they're called. You have to kill all of them before you can even travel to another boss platform. I am not a fan of that kind of style of dungeon. It's very, very linear, and especially once you get past that point, the whole dungeon becomes very boss rushy. There's like almost no trash at all, and the same kind of runtime issue exists in this dungeon as it does in the first one, right? There's a lot of those portals you're taking that put you on a flight point. I feel like all those flight point portals you should try and make them instant portals, in my opinion, especially because the flight points are not exactly short either. And then sometimes you're teleporting to an empty platform that you then have to run across and then take another flight point portal. So I don't know. I feel like make those a little bit more direct, eliminate some of that travel time, and you can make the dungeon timer shorter to compensate for that. And I think all players would be happy. Like, that's a perfectly fine trade-off players are happy to give. Give us a shorter overall timer, but cut out some of that travel time. And I personally am happy with that trade-off. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Some other things in this dungeon, the gauntlet still exists. It got recently nerfed, but I cannot emphasize how frustrating it would be to have to do this gauntlet every single time in Mythic Plus. I don't know. I am not a fan of it. Maybe it's just because I'm bad, and so I get hit every time. But I am not a fan of having this gauntlet here. But it's still here. It's a little nerfed, but it's not that nerfed. So we'll see what ends up happening here with the gauntlet. Currently still exists. Some bosses are definitely going to be a bit more problematic in this dungeon than the first part of the dungeon. I think Morchi, of course, going to slaughter pugs. There's a neat little weak ore. We'll see if that gets broken. That can help you identify which Morchi is the correct one, but not sure that's going to end up surviving until the game goes live. I will link it in my guides if it's still a thing by then. The last boss is actually very, very heavy for tank damage, so be aware. It's maybe one of the harder hitting bosses for tanks in that first phase when you're constantly getting pelted with the breath, the dot from the breath, and then the bolts from the keeper ads that spawn in that first phase there, so very, very high damage. And then, of course, you've got bounce the orbs, and then the phase 2 damage is not low across the party either, so a lot going on that last boss. Maybe just a light touch to tank damage might be needed, but otherwise, it's just harder designed bosses, so definitely not going to be as pug-friendly as the first half, and personally, I think I enjoy the first half a bit better. I'm not sure how I feel about the whole boss rush Mythic Plus dungeon yet, but we'll have to see with a bit more testing and how it kind of shapes up over the season. All right, now let's go talk through our pack of BFA and Legion dungeons, which generally have gone through the least changes out of any of the 8 dungeons in this pool, as they've already existed in Mythic Plus before. So these areas are going to be a little bit shorter than the Dawn areas or the areas at the end, talking about Everbloom and Throne of the Tide. So starting off, Waycrest Manor got a pretty significant change with doors just being open at the beginning, no RNG, absolutely fantastic change. Otherwise, there's just very minor boss and trash changes. Nothing really crazy. Witches are a lot easier now, actually, than they were back in BFA, so that's nice. I think, though, this dungeon is certainly going to highlight how terrible the Sanguine affix is in the current dungeon pool. Once again, I am absolutely begging for some real nerfs to Sanguine, such as a larger delay before the ticking starts, a healing cap, anything, both. Let's go, please, I beg. Nerf Sanguine, remove Sanguine. I'm happy with both, but something needs to happen. This dungeon and later on, Black Rook Hold has some nice Sanguine troll spots, so I have a feeling those 2 dungeons are going to be banned on Sanguine weeks, but we'll see. Otherwise, though, this dungeon is kind of how I remembered it, which is good because I actually liked this dungeon a fair bit back in battle for Azeroth. Again, I wasn't a big key pusher or anything. I didn't push super high keys, so I don't really have that perspective back in BFA, but I enjoyed this dungeon then, so hopefully I will enjoy it now. Atal'Dazar is in a similar boat to Waycrest, though I think even less changes maybe to the trash and bosses in Atal'Dazar compared to Waycrest. I think the big thing is snapping. So snapping to Murozond, the T-Rex. The T-Rex boss still works. It still snaps your entire party or whatever, so you can snap stuff to that boss. But snapping kind of outside of that doesn't really work well, if at all. So I would like to see maybe some more compensation nerfs to those Saurids, because those guys are still pretty scary. And that was like the only way you really dealt with them on higher keys, to my knowledge, back in BFA, and they're still very, very, very dangerous. So we'd like to see those get a light tap so they maybe don't leap and murder your entire party. Some good changes though. Honor Guard on the right side before the undead boss has actually been, one of them has been taken out of that pack, making it a lot easier to both skip or do if you aren't going to skip it, right? So that's pretty nice for sure. But otherwise, it's very, very minor changes to stuff, and everything is probably going to be kind of as you remember it if you play this dungeon a lot in BFA. So nothing too big in this dungeon, but you know, honestly, this dungeon, it seems to be like a pretty fine Mythic Plus dungeon in its current state, so not too unhappy with how this is looking. Next up, Black Rook Hold. Big thing about this dungeon is the time walking count changes are in. So basically, if you're W keying from the beginning of the dungeon, killing everything in your path all the way to the end, you get to like just barely over 100% count. Unlike in Legion, where you were like, I think you were like way over count, so you could like skip a ton of the trash. You can't do that anymore. So you have to pull a significant amount of the dungeon here, so be aware of that. I don't remember being a big fan of Black Rook Hold back in Legion, but I think this is one of the more enjoyable dungeons for me actually on the PTR. I'm being converted to a Black Rook Hold fan. That's crazy to me. Like Waycrest, like I mentioned before, there are some pretty tight areas of the dungeon. So Sanguine Weeks may be a little cursed. There's a lot of ranged mobs in this area as well. There's a lot, like archer mobs, caster mobs, that kind of thing. So you know, we'll see how cursed this place gets in Sanguine. I think again the bosses have seen pretty minimal changes. Trash has seen pretty minimal changes, just because you know everything's been working pretty well. I actually can't even think off the top of my head anything that's you know pretty outliery in terms of like trash or bosses. Maybe that the last boss, there's that area on the last boss, if you guys remember back in Legion, maybe where you take a Shadow Bolt volley before you get your big buff on that last boss. That part seems very, very scary, much scarier than I remember it. And the bugs on that boss seem very scary, but maybe I'm just not remembering. It didn't seem like unlivable or anything like that, but potentially something where, you know, a pug group not expecting that to go out and who didn't press their defensive just instantly dies, right? So something to be aware of maybe there. But otherwise, the dungeon seemed pretty solid, honestly. I'm again, like I said, I'm being converted to a Black Rook Hold enjoyer, which I did not expect. So hey, there you go. Joining Black Rook Hold with the Legion dungeons is, of course, the other Val'sharah dungeon, Darkheart Thicket. Again, very, very similar, very minimal changes to how I remembered it back in Legion. Individual mobs definitely in need of tuning in this place. I think a lot of the animals, cats at the beginning, kind of bears at the beginning as well. You're skipping a lot of the bears right now on PTR. Most groups are like the double bear pull. You're just, nope, see ya. I think the Dryads, their Poison Spear is absolutely nuking, I believe. And then the bats at the end of the dungeon are absolutely nuking as well. So those are the four kind of big trash outliers that maybe need a light touch in either direction. As currently, like I said, most groups are just skipping all those mobs. Like they're skipping, you know, not Dryads so much, but they're skipping, you know, anything outside of the first cat pull, which like they found a snap spot in the first area. They're skipping as many bears again outside of that first bear. They're skipping the bats. So yeah, just if you want to see those mobs we play, they need to be nerfed. So hopefully that happens. Otherwise, not too much to talk about. I think the tree boss, again, absolutely slaps tank still with his breath and then his grip attack. So tanks beware. That's going to be a tank murderer for sure, kind of alongside, I think that boss, and then the final boss in Dawn of the Infinites, the guy with all the summoning the portals, like I mentioned before. Those are two of the hardest tank bosses, I think, so far in this pool. And then I think there's one boss in Everbloom and one boss in Throne that'll probably be kind of those four really, really tank needs to live kind of fights. So those are always nice if they feel good to play against, so we'll have to see. But overall, again, I'm not like the biggest fan of Darkheart Thicket, but I think it's a fine dungeon. It's nice and quick, and it's kind of like how I remembered it back in Legion. So like I said, like these 4 dungeons from BFA and Legion, they haven't really seen a bunch of changes, just some small quality of life changes and some minor tuning adjustments to some bosses and trash. That brings us to the dungeons that have seen kind of the biggest changes, as they were never part of a Mythic Plus and they're much older. Let's start with Everbloom from Warlords of Draenor. So this was a challenge mode dungeon, so they do have some things to kind of go off of, but it wasn't ever in Mythic Plus. So we've had some of the trash abilities rearranged. Of course, some of those skips, jumping over walls, those were fixed previously and still don't work. The first 2 bosses are fairly similar. I would say the last 2 bosses have some pretty significant changes, and then that optional spider boss is just gone. You don't go that way ever. That boss is just gone, which is a good change. I think 5 boss dungeons can be pretty rough, and that boss was kind of off in the middle of nowhere, so glad that's gone. Personally, I'm actually a pretty big fan of the current iteration of this place. You get some nice big pulls early on with some of those flowers that don't really do much besides to your tank, and that's counterable with some utility from, you know, paladins or a slow break of any kind or Tiger's Lust, that kind of thing. The bosses are a bit more hit and miss for me. The first and last, I personally, as a tank player, kind of find them boring. Really enjoy the second and the third ones, though you will definitely want to have at least one ranged player, whether that's your healer or DPS player, or maybe even 2 of them, to kind of help you out with some mechanics, as there's some mechanics that are baited on the furthest player available, and if you're in a 5 melee stack or even a 4 melee stack, it can be quite difficult to handle some of those mechanics, so be aware of that. One outlier I would say in terms of trash is before the 3rd boss, kind of everything in that area almost. There's basically some regular mobs that just absolutely truck your tank. And then the other lieutenant mobs in this area, there's 3 casters that kind of mimic the boss's abilities, but the problem is they're lieutenants, and all of their kickable casts are random target and lethal or very close to lethal or going to be lethal on high fortified keys. And it's just, if you don't have a prop paladin, if you don't have a vengeance demon hunter, or if you don't have just like everyone with like a melee kick, there's like those casts are going through, and you're forced to actually pull 3 of those lieutenant mobs in one pull before the boss itself, which is just, it's problematic to say the least. So something needs to change, I think, in that area for sure. But other than that, I'm a pretty big fan of this dungeon overall as well. That leaves just one more dungeon left, Throne of the Tides, which, as I said, was made available this week. It's also the biggest rework out of any of the dungeons, so something to keep in mind here is that there's probably going to be a ton of changes to this dungeon over the next 2 weeks as we see further iteration on the testing of this dungeon. So I'm not going to talk too much about tuning here, but I will kind of talk about just how I'm liking the general idea of the rework. So like I'm saying, excessive kicks, kind of similar to Everbloom, where it does feel like there's you know, if you don't have a prop paladin or vengeance demon hunter who has access to the ton of kicks, you're going to be in a problem. I expect some of those will be removed or not made spam cast. Like there's a pack before the last boss, which I think has 6 casters that do spam random target casts. And it's like, there is no way that pack is supposed to exist. So again, minor thing, but I'm assuming that's getting sent into oblivion. There's no way that pack goes live the way it is. So I'm assuming that gets fixed. Overall, in terms of the bosses, I think most of them have a decent rework. There's not too much changed for like the first boss with the ad waves. Thankfully, the ad waves did seem to be percent based, so that's one thing too. Is like, that's a percent based phase transition, not a timer based. I'm sure if you've been here for, you know, a patch or 2, you know how much I hate timer based bosses. I'm a much bigger fan of percent based bosses, and we're getting that here with the first boss. You now do have to do that optional boss on the right, though, so keep that in mind. This is a 4-boss dungeon now. You have to go to the right, but that guy is also going to be a tank-busting boss a bit. He drops like a totem that makes him attack a bunch faster, so he's going to be crushing tanks a bit, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I actually really like what they've done to the last boss as well. It's basically like this ink boss in the center of the room that you're fighting, and you get ads that do spawn in that you kind of need to group up and cleave down, and someone like gets buffed to basically be like a fire hose, which to like clean up some of the puddles on the ground. It's actually pretty cool. I really like that rework. Second boss, I'm a bit undecided. It seems a bit meh. But, you know, we'll see. Basically, like, spawn some, there's ads that spawn from puddles and they get knocked back when you touch them, kind of thing. But it's kind of like Underrot, where there's just going to be, Underrot last boss, sorry, where, like, there's just going to be some specs that are constantly doing damage, that they can just constantly push those guys back and make them a non-mechanic kind of deal. So, otherwise, actually, it's very much like the Underrot last boss, where you want to stay as a group and kind of go around in a circle, kind of around the room, to filter all those ads into one spot and have them be knocked back, kind of thing. But overall, actually, I think I am feeling more positive about this rework than I did about Vortex Pinnacle, which I'm still not the biggest fan of Vortex Pinnacle. It's okay, but that was the only other Kata dungeon that's been made into a Mythic Plus dungeon, so I have more hope for Throne of the Tides for sure. But again, very, very early for testing in this dungeon. There's going to be a bunch of changes, so we'll have to see how it ends up. But there we have it, guys. Those are my thoughts on the Season 3 dungeon pool going into patch 10.2. Personally, as someone who didn't do a lot of pushing back in BFA, back in Legion, I'm a big fan of this dungeon pool, as it is still pretty new feeling to me, but I would love to hear what you guys think down in the comments below. Are you disappointed with all of these older dungeons being used? Were you hoping to see maybe some more of those older Dragonflight dungeons being put in, maybe some entirely new Dragonflight dungeons being made? Let me know down in the comments below. Reminder, I will be putting out guide videos for every single dungeon and raid boss in Season 3. That includes my pug-friendly routes to start off the season, the highly requested quick guides, so shorter, more condensed guide videos for things that people have been really, really interested in. That's going to be coming out, so please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's free to do, and it helps me out a ton. Before signing off, I got to shout out my Patreon supporters, of course. I appreciate you guys so much. Thank you for everything you do. Otherwise, thanks everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.